Evening, everybody. Why don't we get started? I'm James Heimowitz. I'm the president of China Institute, and it's a delight to welcome all of you this evening. We're in for a real treat. For those of you that know China Institute, you know our programs, you know our mission and vision and values to try to help Americans have a really more authentic, genuine insight into China through its language. You might know us through our school, through art and culture. You might know us through our gallery and through our public programs. Dinda Elliott's here tonight going to be moderating what promises to be a fascinating panel. I just had the chance a little bit before you all joined and logged in to talk to some of the interesting participants and presenters and panelists this evening. And personally, it's so fascinating to me when we think about everything that's going on between China and the US at a political level. We often lose sight of the fact about what the engines are that make us tick around the world. And we lose sight of the fact that businesses are moving forward, artists are doing their work, life is going on. And in many ways, when we think about the responsibility to our planet in terms of what it means to have electric vehicles and fossil fuels and the way forward, China is actually leading the way in many ways. It's a complex subject, but for me personally, I go back to when I was a young consultant and my very first client was General Motors in China. And I think about where we've come in the last 25 years in this regard. It's a long way. We have a long way to go. And I think for those of us who are concerned about the future of our planet, we really understand that the China-America relationship is so important to the future of the planet. And I can't think of an area where the intersection is more important than the future of electric vehicles. So I want to take this opportunity to welcome all of you. If you haven't already, please visit our website, join us, help support us so that we can continue to bring programs like this to life. But that's just what I wanted to say. And just a quick other note to let you know that we will be thinking about reopening up in person. We'll be starting our summer camp program for kids this summer, just around July 4th. And we're also thinking actively about how we reintegrate and bring programs back in a hybrid manner, no pun intended with the word hybrid, in a hybrid manner at China Institute. But the flip side of it is the fact that we're meeting together virtually means that we can connect people in a real-time way, much more fluidly than we could in person. We've got panelists joining us from different parts of the US and from China. So with that introduction, I want to hand it over to the head of our programs, Dinda Elliott, to introduce this evening's panel.
Thank you, James. And welcome, everybody. This is the second in our series called Getting to Zero. And the first program in that series featured Jeff Sachs, the economist, and Ma Jun, the pioneering environmental expert in China. And tonight's program, of course, is looking much more at the business side of things. But as James said, electric vehicles is, very much about the future of our planet as well. And we have three incredible experts with us this evening. So I'm delighted to introduce them. Frank Girardot heads communications at the North American operations of BYD, which is one of China's leading battery and EV companies. Tu Li, who is calling in from Changzhou in China. I was going to say Beijing, but he's in Changzhou today. Is founder and managing director of Sino Auto Insights, an advisory firm that helps organizations bring tech-focused products and services to the transportation and mobility sectors. And Tu's newsletter is a must-read for people in the auto industry. Our third speaker is John Paul MacDuffie, who's a professor of management at the Wharton School and director of the program on vehicle and mobility innovation at the Mack Institute of Innovation Management. He is truly one of the world's thought leaders on the future of mobility. So we are thrilled to have them all. preparing for this panel a couple of days ago, Professor MacDuffie shared with us a headline from the New York Times from 2009. The headline said, China vies to be world's leader in electric cars. That was 2009, 12 years ago. It was April 1st. The headline appeared on April 1st, but it was no joke. And last week, another article appeared in the New York Times, this time about the US policy. And the headline read, Biden's push for EVs, $174 billion, 10 years, and a bit of luck. That article also appeared on April 1st. So in a funny coincidence, but what an amazing thing that 12 years ago, China was said to be vying to be the world's leader in electric cars. And so we all know that Mary Barra recently announced that GM is betting its future on electric vehicles. That and Biden's new policies, of course, have attracted a lot of attention in the US. So the race is finally on. But wait a minute. As it turns out, exemplified by that New York Times article from 12 years ago, the race has been on in China for a very long time already. China sold 1.3 million electric vehicles in 2020, and that represented 41% of global EV sales, just a tad behind Europe. China is still far ahead of the United States in EV sales. And so I'd like tonight to start in China. So let's turn to you first to get a little sense of what has been happening in China over the last 12 years since that New York Times article appeared. Who are the top EV companies? I read recently that there are something like 400 EV companies in China. And that the 5 most prolific EV fundraisers raised about $21 billion of fresh capital since January 2020. So what is going on? I mean, here we are in the States excited that, GM and we're getting into EVs, but obviously China's way into it already. So give us a sense of what's going on. And by the way, before you answer, I do want to say we will take questions from the audience at the end. So at about 8:15, we'll take some questions. So if you would please type your questions into the Q&A, chat section, and hopefully we'll get to them at the end. So, but over to you two. Give us a sense of what's been going on in China.
Good morning, Dinda, Frank, John, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone else that's on this call. First, about 12 years ago, the Chinese government made batteries, clean energy, and the electric vehicles a priority, a strategic priority for the country, and they started funding R&D efforts and began subsidy program for electric vehicles. And so that was kind of the spark that lit the fuse for electric vehicles. And if we fast forward a few years, this is where Frank's company comes into play, right? Because BYD was a pioneer in electric vehicles. And, I do have to give BYD credit on other things because, they're very diversified. They make chips, they make mobile phone batteries, they make mobile phones. You might not know this, but I'm sure Frank does. They're the largest mask manufacturer in the world now because of COVID. And they did that in less than a year. And what we're seeing over the last 5 or 6 years was this proliferation of EV startups in China because the Chinese government was really, up until now, they've spent about $60 billion in subsidies and tax rebates to the customers. And 6 years ago, you saw NIO come into play, Li Auto and Xpeng over the next couple of years, and they're actually being traded as ADRs on the U.S. stock exchanges right now. And NIO is a $65 billion company. And to your point about $20 billion being raised.
I bet a lot of the people on the call have never heard of it.
Yeah. And, these are companies that are really, really pushing and starting to keep to the space where legacy automakers like GM, Volkswagen, only just in the United States, but in China And the EV, the NEV push, new energy vehicles, so that includes hybrids and hydrogen fuel cells. It's kind of leveled the playing field, right? Where bigger isn't necessarily better, because software is eating the world, right? At Sino Auto Insights, we have three tenets. You know, the first tenet is all companies will become software companies or are software companies. The second is innovation is moving east to west, and the third is you're not moving fast enough. So I think we're seeing that play out in the EV sector, because today I saw that the Silverado was being announced as electric, whereas here 2 weeks from now the Shanghai Auto Show, and you're going to start to see pretty much every brand introduce electric vehicles. And number two, there's going to be all types of innovation and technology stuffed into them. So I think we're kind of running in China, whereas the United States is crawling, learning to walk in the end.
Wow. So to a question for you, as I said, I read that there are something like 400 electric vehicle companies in China, but is it getting to the point where there are kind of four? Does China have the big four, its own big four? Are there a handful of top companies that are really already very much taking the lead? Whoops, I'm afraid might be frozen. So
Yeah.
Did you hear me? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just mentioned those three: NIO, Li Auto, and Xpeng. I would add WM Motor, who's been their sales have been pretty decent over the last few years. So I call those the big four. They're probably going to be IPOing this year as well. But over the last 6 to 8 weeks leading up to the Shanghai Auto Show, what we're seeing is what we saw in the United States: tech companies really coming in to the forefront and saying, you know what, well, I can do this, right? Because the future of transportation and mobility is going to be services, or it's going to be, data driven, right? And I'm an expert, right? So we have Xiaomi, Didi Chusheng, which is China's Tesla, or China's Uber, has also just announced that they're going to get into EVs as well now. So we have Baidu, we have Alibaba, the traditional bat, what they call them, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, and so it's going to be messy. It's going to be ultra competitive because there still needs to be a lot of capital invested in order for the market to mature. But you can bet over the next 24 to 30 months, everyone's going to be elbowing for positioning in the market. And in China, the meat of the market, where BYD plays, where Geely plays, around the 30, 40, 50,000 US dollar price point, that's going to be pretty brutal, because on top of that, we have the legacies like Volkswagen brand, GM with Buick and Chevrolet. They're all coming in order to be part of the future of the largest automotive market in the world, right?
So before I turn to John Paul to talk a little bit about what he sees going on in the States and the sort of global perspective, tell us a little bit about how China has driven demand. What's the government's policy been to get the EV sector rolling? Because that's certainly been an issue in the States, right? People have been, happy to buy their SUVs, and there hasn't been that much of a demand here, which, John Paul will talk about that in a minute, but what have they done in China to get that market going?
Are you talking to me?
Yes. Yeah.
So they had a two-headed monster early on. They gave subsidies to the automotive firms. So the EV companies were receiving up to $12,000-$15,000 per vehicle, depending on the size of the battery and the price of the vehicle. And then also they were on the customer side, they were giving the tax rebates, so you didn't have to pay tax on an electric vehicle. And in some of the larger cities, they were giving license plates to these vehicles. So that spurred a bit of the demand. But then the Chinese government recently, pre-COVID, decided they were going to lay off some of those subsidies and focus more on creating infrastructure. And so one of Tesla's biggest advantages in the United States and China is that they have this private charging network for Tesla customers only because their charging infrastructure is proprietary. So what the Chinese government has done over the last 12 or 18 months is really started to focus on tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities and investment in charging infrastructure. But the private sector has also taken over with NEO specifically putting in battery swapping stations in place. And so there's different ways of fighting or managing that range anxiety and the charging time necessary for the current battery technology. And I think the United States, the Biden administration, if they can get this infrastructure bill approved, we'll start seeing that, I believe, investment in charging infrastructure, research and development on battery technology and capacity, because currently 90%.
Whoops, 90%. We're gonna move. We'll catch that, the end of that sentence in a minute.
I think you have investment in battery cell capacity. Oh.
Okay, you know what? We're a little splotchy, so I'm going to turn to John Paul for a minute now. But clearly, you know, it sounds like what Tu is telling us is that China is well along in the process of developing their, you know, charging infrastructure, all this kind of stuff. So, John Paul, tell us what you're seeing in the States. You know, GM's in the race, and the rest of the big four or whatever are in the race, and the Biden administration is now planning to invest in EV infrastructure. So can America catch up, given that China's been doing this for 12 years?
I mean, certainly we can. I don't think there's much the US can't do when it has the resolve and it, you know, devotes the resources to the task at hand. But there's a lot of moving parts that I think have to kind of come together for us to see more rapid progress. You know, the consumer demand side is certainly one that has always, you know, been lagging and has discouraged the auto companies from moving ahead faster. We've had these problems with momentum swings. You know, we've had 2 or 3 times when we've been at maybe the tipping point for electric vehicles, and then it just hasn't caught on. And often it seems to reset almost to zero again in terms of the public attention and even the company attention to that. So, you know, a little bit advance each time, but that's been a problem. And of course, the policy swings have been a problem too. You know, I have some colleagues at Carnegie Mellon who did some consumer surveys in the US and China back in like 2015. And they just found there was more receptivity to electric vehicles in China. On a lot of dimensions, even holding aside subsidies and other kinds of things. You know, one speculation was just a shorter history of everybody being used to having internal combustion engine vehicles, right, and possibly some other things about the government, you know, policy on that. So, I mean, that's one factor, and we're trying to get that to change here in the US now. I know we'll talk more about that. I mean, I think we should remember a couple of things about geography. Both China and the US are huge countries with vast rural distances in between the urban centers. But China has a lot more high-speed rail to connect people moving across the big urban centers now. And they have highways too, but it's not necessarily the case that someone wanting to travel city to city is gonna feel like they have to have a car. It's those long trips where the range anxiety concerns are the greatest and where you really have to have the infrastructure there. And again, China's been doing that, but the US is just, I think, a more car-dependent society for all these reasons of history and geography. Charging infrastructure, Tu already covered a lot of it. You know, I feel like it's part of this momentum swing, and we always come back to this chicken and egg metaphor. You know, no one wants to invest in the infrastructure because there's not enough charging demand, and nobody wants to buy an electric vehicle because they can't get it charged. I've started to like a sort of field of dreams metaphor instead. If you build it, they will come. And of course, that's a statement of faith, not a statement of empirical reality, but faith is part of what gets these kinds of movements going. And China really did that. They forward invested into infrastructure in order to stimulate demand. Mm-hmm. And I don't think any other place in the world, with the possible exception of Norway, has been as willing to do those forward investments to stimulate demand. So we'll see if the US is really ready to change that, but it's quite foreign to the way we thought about that policy. Right. On government policy, just really quick, you know, I think, as Tu said, the Chinese government starting 2009, they're using every single lever policy lever at their command to push this initiative. And that's just not part of what the US government has been willing to do. And, sometimes they've been outright opposed to using policy levers to move the needle on EVs, or it's always been politically contentious. So, the Biden administration is promising to change that in all sorts of ways, but they face a lot of obstacles.
It's so fascinating, John Paul, because it seems like, maybe this is an obvious thing, but perhaps worth saying anyway. It just sounds like there's a major rethink underway about what the government's role should be. If we're going to, we, the United States, are going to remain competitive and, succeed in the race for, technology and electric vehicles, doesn't the government have to play a role that it never played in the past?
I think that rethink is going on, and I think that's certainly true. Even GM, with its big announcement of 2035 having all electric vehicles, they described those as aspirational goals, and they said we'll need a lot of support from government policy to get there, which is not the kind of thing you would have necessarily been hearing from GM in the past. And so, that's a piece of it. Now, a couple of other things I think have pushed GM and the other auto companies in this direction. There are these emission targets which are getting tougher all over the world. Probably the EU in the lead in terms of pushing that. Of course, the US has swung back and forth on that, but they'll go back probably to Obama era emissions policies here. So that provides one kind of driving force. China, is the biggest EV market in the world, requires the foreign multinationals that are there to build electric vehicles and to build it with Chinese batteries and Chinese components. So, these multinationals like GM and Volkswagen, they're going to sell more electric vehicles in China than they are in their home countries for a long time. Scale helps them. They're already scale businesses, and scale helps them immensely with costs. So if they can push up demand in their home countries, add it on to the China demand, that's only going to help them. And then finally, I would say that this, it's maybe part of the reframe to see it as a US versus China competition, as opposed to more of a company or strictly business level competition. And I actually think that will get the US, population and general cultural, sense about this kind of moving in a more active way, because we respond to this sense of competition. We hope it won't go kind of negative and nasty, but I think it actually, in the sense of getting the US out of some of this inertia, could be really good.
Right. Well, that's so interesting in terms of the, new strategic competition that we seem to be facing between the United States and China. That's a way in which perhaps it can be a positive thing. The competition is, at the end of the day, is a good thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And doesn't necessarily need to be, negative. So what role, I was going to ask one thing that you and Tu mentioned the other day, which I think is fascinating, is the idea that US firms and unions, which had resisted change for so long, for the first time are kind of aligned on this policy.
I think it's partly with the promise of, again, getting behind a consistent government policy and seeing this as the growth sector, right? So if ICEs are going to shrink, the UAW has done studies, Fraunhofer in Germany have done studies on electric vehicles need less labor hours, so there's potentially less employment in this EV future. But, if the number of internal combustion engines are shrinking, vehicles are shrinking, and the growth is in EVs, the unions want to be a piece of that, absolutely. And of course, they also want to see batteries and other EV components brought to the US as well. And that's another piece of this competition right now. China dominates all of those component markets. But the EU a couple of years ago started a concerted effort to make sure they weren't left out, that they would have a supply chain for EVs in the EU. And the US is starting to think about that now. So, there's a fascinating case right now facing Biden very soon of a lawsuit between two Korean battery makers. And if he rules one way, there'll be a battery factory in the US churning out a lot of batteries very soon. And if he rules the other way, it'll be slowed way down because of this intellectual property dispute. So that's an interesting dilemma for the Biden administration right out of the chute.
Wow.
So and it has
Frank, I want
And
to
it
get
has a direct impact to
ahead,
GM as well. So
say
Yes.
that
no, I'm
again.
sorry. It has direct impact with GM. So
Yeah, because one of the firms is GM's battery partner, LG Chem. Yep.
Right. So Frank, I want to get to you in a second, but before we turn to you, if you can hear us and if you can, get through the Wi-Fi, you know, what you're talking about is it sounds like there are two completely different conversations underway. That basically, what you got in China is it's already moved on to a question of intense competition between these 400 companies and more tech companies that are jumping into the fray. And there's even been news percolating in China this past week or two about more new players jumping in too, right? Including rumors about BYD, et cetera.
yeah, I think again, we've gotten past the question of if EVs are right, and I think the United States is at that kind of inflection point, whether it's not the question of if anymore, it's how fast, right? And I think that's where the U.S. government needs to come in and say, how can we create competition? Because ultimately, the private enterprises need to launch products that are going to be attractive, right? And that takes a bit of time and investment on the R&D side, but also this creates the opportunity, and this is to John Paul's point, right? However you need to frame it to the U.S. consumer, whether it's China versus U.S., whether it's, United States is still the global technology leader, right? I think just creating awareness and educating consumers on these types of things, right? And the era of making electric cars look electric should be over as well, right? They should be just attractive cars that happen to be powered by electricity, right? And I think what we're going to see is more influence from the tech side as to how vehicles are going to be designed, because auto companies traditionally they chase fit, form, and function, right, when they design a vehicle. But in the tech world, you need to design creating use cases and user experience, right? And I think that's where the United States or the American companies, they do it in China a bit, but they really, really need to play catch up on some of that stuff, right? But currently it's more basic blocking and tackling in the US versus, we have 20, 25, $30,000 cars that are going to include LiDAR, which is an important component in assisted driving, advanced driving systems. And so we're going to see a lot more connected and autonomous features in China than we are the rest of the world.
What are you
And that's
seeing
one of
now
the things.
too? Tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing now in China in terms of the competition underway between the top companies.
So, the EV sector, I don't want to state that it's a slam dunk, right? Because it's still at a critical juncture just because of COVID. And, surprisingly last year, the EU led the world in NEV sales, right? Surpassing China for the first time. And so we're still seeing Tesla dominate, and the China EV companies making their way. Their sales are growing month over month.
So you're
quarter
still
over
seeing
quarter.
Tesla dominating in China?
Yeah.
Okay.
They had their best quarter ever globally in Q1, which is notoriously a weak quarter in China because of Chinese New Year. And so up until last month, this 5,000 US dollar Wuling Hongguan Mini EV, which is about half the size of a Mini, was dominating sales in China, and Tesla overtook them again with their $40,000 or $60,000 Model 3. So the Chinese government still needs the foreign automakers, specifically Tesla, if they're really, really going to move out of this tipping point of EVs and into kind of the mainstream. But we're seeing the private enterprises start launching some terrific vehicles into the market. So I think, let's say in the next 12, 18 months, when the domestic brands have these products in the market, and then the foreign brands have also launched. We're going to see so many different market segments, but they're going to be recategorized, right? Because in China, safety, connectivity are kind of the top two demands from Chinese consumers. And I don't know, and John Paul and Frank, maybe you can help me with this. Connectivity, I don't think is the top 3 or top 4 thing in the US or the EU, but in China, it's extremely important.
What do you mean by connectivity?
Being able to use your social media, being able to, connect to your QQ, which is, Apple Music, because, and we have to remember that the average Chinese consumer is much younger in China than it is in the United States and the EU, right? For instance, Cadillac, I think their average consumer in the United States is over 60 years old. Here it's 37 or something like that. So it's a completely different outlook on how you reach these people, because the people that are buying these products at the 50, 60,000 USD price point, they're all digital native, right? They grew up on social media, whereas how they look at it, it's a part of their lives, right? It's not in the United States, unless you're looking at under 30-year-old. I don't know if you're necessarily looking at the connectivity when you're checking out your Cadillac or your Audi or your BMW, right?
Right. So too, was there some, a couple of days ago, you were excited about some rumors about BYD trying to get into the business. What was happening?
Well, yeah, so that was actually, I believe that was Xiaomi, who is a hardware company here, and they have they're more consumers products, and so I would compare them to an Apple, and so it was kind of the worst kept secret. And Lei Jun, who's the CEO founder of Xiaomi, has decided that he'd like to jump into the EV space. And looking at what Xiaomi is very good at is creating the ecosystem and kind of having everybody, because in the tech world, we're not looking at sales per se, right? Product sales or vehicle sales. We're looking at install base, okay? And he's very popular among the Chinese consumers, and I have plenty of Xiaomi products at home that are all connected to the internet, and so it makes sense, at least from an ecosystem standpoint, for Xiaomi to jump into the race, because they're pretty much a part of everyone else's life. They started by making mobile phones, and then they've acquired a lot of smaller companies and created a home ecosystem, and then the mobile phones. And so the only part of your life that they're not a part of is basically the transportation part. And so,
it's so fascinating.
But that's also where.
So fascinating, the idea of a phone company basically saying we're going to get into EVs, and then why not go to the best and the pioneer, which is BYD. So that's, I guess there are just rumors flying around about that, which brings us to Frank. So Frank, I wonder if you can share with us a little bit. I mean, it's this wonderful test case scenario of operating in the United States. Tell us a little bit about what BYD's business looks like in the United States and what sort of competitive pressures and challenges you're seeing here.
Thanks. And by the way, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. And wow, am I learning a lot from Tu and John Paul. I'll tell you, I think the Chinese vehicle, like the Han, the car, one of the cars that we make, has the potential to astonish the American consumer, like in a way that TikTok astonished the social media user. I think it's so different and so unique that when you get behind the wheel, you're going to go, wow, this is great.
Why do you say that? Tell us a little bit about what is astonishing about it.
I think it's astonishing because I think that here in the United States we have this idea of the Chinese product as being less up to par than the Cadillac or even a Lexus. But the fact of the matter is that many of these cars are, have a fit and finish that's on par with top European models like a Ferrari or a BMW, and prices that are far more consumer friendly. So, and then there's automotive enthusiasts who, are all about handling and on top of all that, and acceleration and all the sort of things that you get when you're looking for a new car. And so, the cars coming here from China will sell themselves. The thing is, though, and John Paul alluded to this, there's this potential. There's so many things happening in the space here in the U.S., but one of them is the negative and nasty component. And we have some firsthand experience with that. We have a union factory in California where we build electric buses and electric trucks. And we sell these to American transit agencies who buy them with funds that are provided by the US government. 2 years ago, the Trump administration worked with Congress to ban us from getting those funds. So the 500 buses that we have in the US and the 40 or 50 transit agencies that use them are in danger of losing funding to buy the buses from this company that is the model citizen. And the key takeaway here is that, we're not a Chinese government company. We're a privately owned company that's Berkshire Hathaway owns 10%. And, but the vehemence against, the idea of somebody coming over from China with, a better technology, a safer bus, and one that, accomplishes the goal that many of these transit agencies have of eliminating greenhouse gases between now and 2035 has met with nothing but resistance from the US government. And a lot of that, and this is, I think, where the rubber meets the road, is fueled by competitors, US competitors. So we have to, this is something that I think the United States is going to have to come to grips with. How does it, accept the publicly traded Chinese company here on US soil? And then, so that's a huge question. And it's something that's going to have to be answered in the next year, I think, as the Biden administration is looking to, in this space, and I won't go too much farther into this, but they're looking to eliminate 50,000 diesel buses in the next 15 years. And we have 40% of the nation's capacity to build them. So if the government, takes the Chinese company out, then the government has also eliminated its ability to, meet its climate goals in the bus space. And that's, by the way, union workers, American union workers. So, okay, so we have to overcome that. But then there's the chicken and the egg problem that John Paul brought up. And the American, infrastructure is completely lacking in its ability to handle an onslaught of electric vehicles. You think about, like, for example, okay, you park the car at your house. How are you going to charge it? And then, what are you going to pay per kilowatt hour on the electricity that you're using? And are you going to charge it during the day? Are you going to charge it at night? How's this going to work? You go to the mall. If there's only, 3 parking spots that are EV friendly and 2 of them are for Tesla, and you're driving a, brand new Cadillac or a BYD, I hope, which space do you get and how does that all work? And then I think the issue, now the range anxiety issue is an important one for the consumer. And we encounter this in the bus and the truck market. There's plenty of innovation that's coming out of China to deal with this. But our infrastructure is really going to have to examine how we do this. How do we, take electric trucks from Los Angeles to San Francisco or over the Rocky Mountains? How do we, move consumers in a city, like Los Angeles? I mean, the huge size of LA, and you're putting people on electric buses. How do you do that? And I think that the competing packages from the Biden administration and from Representative DeFazio and the House T&I committee look to answer some of these questions, but it's gonna, I really think that this is not something that's going to happen with us overnight, but over several years of figuring it out.
So Frank, before we go to kind of more general conversation, and then we'll take some questions from the audience, I wanted you to talk a little bit as well about how BYD is doing in other parts of the world, because it seems like BYD is really, having some tremendous success in Latin America and Europe. Can you tell us a little bit about the growth that
Yeah,
you're
sure.
seeing?
Thank you for that question. That's a nice one. I mentioned that
I don't necessarily want to toss you softballs, but it's really, I think it's important for Americans in the audience to understand just what's going on out there in terms of, how competitive a company like yours is these days. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thanks. So, worldwide, beyond cars and masks, as Tu points out, our biggest products are the heavy duty electric vehicles like buses and trucks. And in South America, we're selling, 400, we've had 400 buses being sold in Colombia, another 400 in Chile. We have a high speed, not a high speed, but a monorail type SkyRail system going into Brazil. In Europe, we're building buses in France and in Hungary. We do all the Alexander Dennis double deckers that are in London. We're working in Canada with the Toronto Transit Commission to build electric buses in Canada. I don't know if I said this number, I'll say it again though. We built 50,000 electric buses that have been delivered to various transit agencies around the world. Our hometown of Shenzhen, which is what everybody says is China's Silicon Valley, is home to many of those buses. We foresee this as sort of becoming, the standard. And then besides buses, here in the US, we're finding a great market for electric refuse trucks. And, we have them in Hyattsville, Maryland, and Florida. We have them all over California. And there's this, this explosion of practical, applications that are embracing the technology, while, in some instances, the government is pushing it away and the consumer is scratching their head saying, well, what do I do and how do I do it when it's time for me to, change from an internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle?
Right. So before we turn to questions from the audience, John Paul and Tu, a question for you. I mean, we all know that the Chinese government has subsidized the development of the EV industry. And that's been, by design, that's their strategy. So companies, all sorts of EV companies in China, including BYD, have received subsidies, et cetera. I guess the question I have, particularly because our audience is American, is that fair? And should the US government be doing the same thing for US companies? I mean, what's your view about that? Is that, again, it comes to the question of kind of industrial policy, I guess.
I'm going to want to answer this one too.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
I mean, it gets to what you said earlier, Dinda, about, is there a rethinking going on?
Yeah.
I mean, industrial policy has been almost, those two words have been almost a dirty word, a dirty phrase in the context of US government policy for quite a while, not throughout US history at all, right? There's the famous Alexander Hamilton report on manufacturers, which set out, a whole bunch of government policies for supporting manufacturing industries that guided the whole US growth into being the biggest manufacturer in the world. And so, there are times in our history when this has been very natural to us, but not recently. The terms of that debate may be changing. But what I wanted to add, I agree that the, government policies to block competition from foreign firms is one of those, nasty turns that the trade wars could take. But, we also have the pushback from the fossil fuels industry, which is very powerful in the US. And I think of the post office contract recently for a whole slew of new delivery vehicles. And, Biden has said one of the first things we can do is have the government buy electric vehicles. But the chief competitors for that included, one mostly electric vehicle bid and then one mostly internal combustion engine bid. And that firm, Oshkosh in Wisconsin, got the contract promising no more than making 10% EV vehicles. I mean, that's like incrementalism of the last few failed efforts to get EV adoption going. And, you know, it was all carried out in the latter years of the Trump administration when they obviously weren't pushing electric vehicles. I don't know if that can be reversed at this point, but it just, you know, the fossil fuel industry is not going to quietly allow a lot of government policies to switch from favoring them, as many of them have. And that's the other irony about industrial policy. There've been a lot of things built in and not so obvious that support certain industries over others. It just doesn't look like the dreaded picking winners and things that gets brought up. So that's a set of issues there. I just want to say I'm not quite as pessimistic about the charging infrastructure issues as maybe was conveyed in the last couple. The suburban and rural owner will be able to have a home charger already. You know, you could buy them on Amazon. Amazon will even come and install them. You can run them off the same 240 volt that a dryer or washing machine runs off. So electricians know how to handle it. So, and the range of the vehicles is now enough that most of your daily commuting, you're not going to need to charge at them all because you've got plenty of range to do that. And people are going to charge at night because the utilities are going to offer them cheaper rates at night. It's easy to program it for that. The electric utilities don't want anybody charging during the peak hours of sort of 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. They want them to charge, so they're going to incentivize that behavior through education plus differential rates. So I think a lot of that piece will sort out rather quickly. It's getting infrastructure into the interstate highway system and into urban areas, multi-use buildings, you know, crowded, congested neighborhoods. That's the real challenge, and that's where I think the Biden administration should focus.
And of course, that's my perspective because I live in a crowded urban area with
Me too.
you know, where people rent their homes, and it's not so easy to do that stuff. But you're absolutely right, and point taken. I want to go just back a little bit to the subsidy question. And point out that, you know, the subsidies that China offers to its own manufacturers are the same subsidies that are available to Tesla. Or if GM wanted to build there, those subsidies would be available as well, because primarily and I'm sure Tu knows more about the intricacies of this, but primarily they go to the consumer. So the consumer gets a benefit for buying an electric car, and which is a lot like what California does, either giving access to the lane or giving a rebate of some sort. And you know, that's probably the way. I mean, I don't know how it works because you know, it's constantly changing and experimenting here in the U.S. with, you know, do we incentivize the manufacturer or do we incentivize the buyer? But the thing is, it's like consumers will drive the change, and so and I think that's how it works best, at least in our experience.
So I think that John Paul and Frank did a good job of kind of discussing and summarizing the industrial policy. You know, I just want to look at it from an innovation standpoint, right? And John Paul, he knows this very well, and Frank knows this very well. China is the largest automotive market in the world at 22 million cars a year. The United States is second. And the reality is the Volkswagens, the GMs, and Fords, their product planning in Detroit and in Stuttgart and in Wolfsburg, they're working around what's happening in China and pushing it to the rest of their region. It's not, okay, I'm going to build cars and design vehicles for the EU market. I'm looking at, you know, creating these economies of scale. Because remember that Volkswagen sold 9 million cars or 8.5 million cars last year. And so in order to keep that number high, they have to sell a lot of cars in China. I think they sold a little over 3.5 million cars alone in China. And so that's the reality. And I think the private sector is taking over and saying, okay, I'm not going to build two different powertrains and invest in research and development on two different powertrains. I'm just going to create the least number of platforms that I can and bolt on different types of electric motors and battery cells to accommodate the small vehicles, the medium-sized vehicles, and the large vehicles, right? And to the question of subsidies, Tesla, for their entire 17-year existence, has lived off of subsidies, right? They've lived off of subsidies. They've lived off of credits, tax credits, because the Chinese government adopted essentially what California did 15 years ago, right, Frank? This credit system where the car companies that aren't building enough EVs have to buy EV credits from the car companies that are. And Tesla is profitable because of these EV credits, right? And so China has adopted that. So more now we're going back to the industrial policy, but that's been happening in California and the United States as well. And so there's subsidies in place for these companies, right? But at the end of the day, the private sector really needs to step up on the innovation and building products that U.S. consumers want, right? And we're seeing the Hummer, we're seeing the Mach-E, so that's starting to happen, right? But this is where the U.S. government needs to come into play, right? It can't be these stops and starts. It needs to build momentum so that we can get to that tipping point, and then the private enterprises, because it's an entire supply chain that needs to be switched over. It's not just cars, right? It's charging infrastructure, it's different suppliers, it's connected suppliers, it's cloud systems, it's V2X, which is infrastructure communicating with vehicles. This is the future 10, 12, 15 years out, right? And I'm hoping that because Buttigieg and Granholm are both from the Midwest, and for those that don't know, Granholm was actually the governor of Michigan for I think 8 years. So she knows intimately well what's happening in the U.S. automotive sector. She probably has Mary Barra, Jim Farley, and those guys on speed dial, right? So she has informal advisors telling her from an energy standpoint how to roll this out, right? And so I don't think there could be two better advocates. And Buttigieg was the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. So you can bet Indiana has benefited immensely from the U.S. auto sector, right?
Yeah.
And so I think those two factors are really, really helpful for the U.S. just finally pivoting towards the clean tech sector. And unfortunately, to Frank's point about the buses, we just don't have that many innovative EV bus companies, and so we want the best product, right? As Americans, that's what we want. We want competition, right? Because competition drives innovation and drives down costs, right? But once the United States has global competitive products in the EV sector, I think we're going to be fine. But the industrial policy stuff, I think they covered pretty well. But that's kind of how I look at
John Paul,
what's going to be happening.
Thank you. Yeah, I think John Paul, you had something you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, just to say that we may have overemphasized the federal level in this discussion because it's absolutely true that California policy on environment, and auto industry, and emissions, and electric vehicles, and all that has really driven the forward edge of U.S. policy. And then there's 13, 14 states, mostly in the Northeast, that have decided to follow the California standards. And then you've got the governors and the states. You're going to have these bus contracts are mostly going to be, yes, federal money is involved, and that's where this Trump administration policy was problematic, but often those are more decentralized. And I think but you need consistent federal policy to back it up. And obviously, the battle with California, which the Trump administration decided to wage openly, made the auto companies choose, which side they were going to back, and they completely split. And, they need to do long-range technology planning, product planning, et cetera. They can't have, and they're planning for the globe, they're not just planning for the US. So they can't have these wild swings in federal policy. And the possibility that the state and local levels can be engines of innovation only happens if the federal policy is consistent and supports it.
Yeah, and I don't mean to, I'm sorry, Dinda, just one thing. I don't mean to overstate this, but I'm going to be very clear. I mean, we're looking at packing our bags, not firing them, but laying off most of our employees and moving on if the policy stays in place that won't allow us to do that won't allow us to build. It's outrageous that the government would take on a private company the way that they have in our case. I mean, we're serious about leaving.
Yeah. So I'm going to determine right now, we have 5 minutes, so I'm going to say let's go to 8:35. With your permission, we're going to go for 5 extra minutes, okay? Because we just have so much to
Overtime.
Yeah.
Time.
So
It's
a
overtime.
question from the audience. Someone is asking, can you talk about the power grid capacity to handle the inflow of EVs in China, compared to the United States? So talk a little bit too about power grid capacity, and then John Paul or Frank.
I'm going to be quite frank. I don't study that very closely.
Okay. Yep.
But I think they are, because infrastructure like that, the power grid is actually a national security issue as well, right? So there's a lot of investment going into China on that side of it, but also battery storage or energy storage is a cutting edge technology that's starting to proliferate in China. But I believe, and I've lived here 11 years, if the Chinese government believes that that needs to be a priority, they will remedy the situation fairly quickly. I think the grid issue, specifically in places like California, are probably a more serious issue in the U.S. than it is in China. And I'm no expert on that though. So.
You know what? I'm going to jump to go ahead, John Paul, and then I'm going to jump to the next question.
Yeah, so just really quick, I mean, I think at first, some years back, there was a lot of fear of the utilities of electric vehicles. And then I think conceptually they saw that if you time stagger the charging, and if you actually get to the point where people with their vehicles plugged in at home can sell power back to the grid, it's less of an issue. But we saw from the Texas, grid failure during that brutal winter weather and a bunch of other policies, the grid is vastly under-maintained and isn't ready in that sense. It's not so much that EVs will bring a whole lot of new demand that it can't handle. It's having trouble handling the demands of the moment without more investment in, yes, infrastructure maintenance and the like.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I've got a question about autonomy. So the question is, are each of the Chinese companies developing their own systems, or how is that working too? Who are the lead companies supplying this technology in China?
So I think when we talk autonomy, we're getting to the point where we need to talk specific use cases. So robo taxis are probably the farthest out, right? Where there's no driver, there's no steering wheel, there's no pedals. And John Paul and Frank, I'd love to hear your perspective, but I'm thinking it's at least 10 to 12 years out. Low speed autonomous delivery vehicles, that's here and now, right? We see those in parks. We see those I see it in a hotel, right? I was in a hotel in Shanghai, and there's this autonomous maitre d' waitress that was speaking in Chinese and cleaning the floor and answering questions, simple questions, right? So, and then we're also seeing commercial trucking, right? Companies like Too Simple, like Aurora Tech, they're trying to revolutionize over the road trucking because there's a shortage of truck drivers in the U.S., right? But for the purpose of summarizing the robo-taxi space here in China, there's 4 or 5 that I'll mention: AutoX, Pony.ai, WeRide.ai, Momenta, and Baidu, which has this Apollo project. And they all happen to also have R&D centers or technical centers in Palo Alto or Silicon Valley. So they would tell you that some of them will tell you that they're actually American companies with Chinese subsidiaries, but it's a difficult thing to distinguish, to be quite frank, because Pony and AutoX have pilot programs, robotaxi programs, and food delivery programs in the U.S. Okay, in China they have robotaxi pilots in Changsha, in Shanghai, in Guangzhou, where you, as a consumer, you can go test one out. Some of them don't even have safety drivers. So I think those guys are leading the way, and we should start to see them IPOing in the U.S. or in Hong Kong or in Shanghai, probably within the next 20 to 24 months. Now, on the US side, there's Waymo, there's Argo, which has been heavily invested in by Ford and Volkswagen. There's Cruise, which is owned by GM, but has external investment from SoftBank and I think Toyota, I want to say. So
Honda.
that competition is, yeah, Honda, that's right. And that competition is all heating up. But again, I think the immediate opportunities are different use cases. The robotaxis are a bit farther out because there's policy concerns and there's just not enough data with how fast these vehicles go. I think the technology is there, but the data isn't. And so, what do you guys think?
I mean, my basic line on this, yes, I don't disagree with the timelines that you've described. You know, there's all these lower, you know, earlier level autonomy features that get put in as safety features into more and more, you know, all vehicles and as standard equipment. And so, you know, that's the kind of quiet incremental advance that will increase the amount of autonomy in the vehicles, you know, lane sensing and automatic braking and a bunch of possibly some highway
Adaptive cruise control.
controls and yes, that kind of thing. So, you know, that will keep happening as we wait for the big breakthrough of the level 4, level 5 fully autonomous without a driver, but that's still going to be helping. I mean, the thing that I'm watching with a lot of interest is, and my, I guess, prediction is that the auto companies and the tech companies are going to have to work together on this, not because they want to, but because they both have knowledge that the other needs. And it's kind of obvious, I think, what the tech companies have that the auto companies don't have. And maybe there's a little too much, to my mind, a narrative of the tech companies just win everything because, you know, digital is the future, software is the future. They're incredibly rich, they attract the talent, et cetera. But you know, the knowledge of the physical realm, the mastery of the complex global supply chains, the manufacturing process, an incredibly competitive low margin business. These tech companies don't want to get into that. Tesla did. Tesla proved they could do it by becoming an auto company. But I don't think Apple's really going to want to do that. I don't think most of the Chinese tech companies are going to want to do it either. So you get all these interesting alliances between the tech companies and the auto companies. And those dynamics are going to be, you know, to be a fly on a wall and watch those companies try to figure these things out. Because the battle over who controls the data, who's going to monetize it, how that gets shared, other kinds of issues of who owns the customer. I mean, again, the tech companies are better at it, but the auto companies bring a bunch of knowledge to that's valuable. And last point, they are the ones who have been historically responsible to society for validating quality, safety, other things. That's a big responsibility that the auto companies don't necessarily love. But by virtue of having that role, it sort of situates them in a more secure way in the ecosystem going forward. And again, makes them, I think, a partner you can't escape working with if you're a tech company.
I'll call them.
I'm going to say 2 words: blockchain and connectivity. And that's the intersection between the auto and the tech makers is, you know, the implementation of really strong blockchain connectivity, and then, you know, and once that's like everybody's comfortable with that in the way the Chinese consumer is, I think that we can make that jump to, you know, a higher level of autonomous vehicle.
Wow. So I think, go ahead too.
I'd like to call them. I'd like to call them frenemies, John Paul. You know, the tech guys and auto guys.
Yeah.
And ultimately, you know, it comes down to what John Paul alluded to. And Frank did with the connectivity, right? Does Apple, does that brand, will you trust it with your safety? Because, you know, most consumers trust GM and Ford and the car companies with their safety, right? But can the tech companies bridge that gap between, okay, I love using my Apple product to connect to everything, but, you know, do I trust it with my life, right? And so I think that's kind of where the tech companies need to bridge that gap. So
I think this is a great note to end this conversation on. I mean, I wish we could go on and on and on, but I found this whole conversation actually extremely kind of inspiring and made me feel optimistic in the sense that it sounds like what you're all saying. I mean, I definitely tend to see the glass as half full as opposed to half empty. So there's a lot of scary stuff too, but what you're saying is that, the market in China is inspiring innovation in America because, and the rest of the world. And you're saying that, what's going on in the States has the potential to inspire innovation in China. And that's a very positive thing. I just think that that idea of the Xiaomis and the Baidus and the Tencents, et cetera, trying to get into the auto industry and getting into EVs, and the Apples in America, and other tech companies getting into EVs. This is truly a revolution, and it's going to be an amazing thing to watch. So I just want to thank you all so much for your insights. We have all learned so much from the three of you tonight, and we hope to get you back again. Please do come back again and speak, on our stage, hopefully in person next time. And I want to thank everybody.
Sure.
Wonderful.
Absolutely.
And I want to thank everybody in the audience for tuning in. I know that you must also feel you've learned an awful lot, just as I have. Please do, as James was saying at the beginning, please do become members of China Institute, because it doesn't cost very much, gives you all kinds of discounts, but most importantly, it allows us to bring amazing conversations like this to you. So please become members. We've got another, just to show the range of what we do, we've got another great program next week on what we're calling architectural acupuncture. So it's the story of an innovative architect in China who is using architecture to revive rural villages. So it's going to be another fascinating program. But wow, thank you to the three of you. You are just brilliant, and we hope to get you back again.
Thank you.
Dinda, thanks for having
us.
Thanks for
Appreciate it.
inviting
Thank you,
us.
John Paul. Nice to
Thanks.
hear you guys.
Yeah, really great pleasure. Thanks.
Take care.